Justice now, and he's going to be talking, well, he's going to introduce himself better than I am in a minute. But yeah, so this is going to be quite like an informal talk. So it's not kind of, it doesn't come down to kind of just regurgitate all this information at you and then that's it, you go home. Like, you want this to be a really kind of motivating thing where at the end we're going to talk and discuss how we can go forward with this whole debate, I guess, with it. And yeah, what we can do as students to kind of bring a movement down here to Falmouth and Exeter, which has already been going on at various other universities across the UK. Yeah.
Great, thanks Anushka. I'll start by just introducing myself, which seems a little bit self-indulgent, but yeah, I'm an activist and campaigner. I work with this organisation, Global Justice Now, which is a campaigning organisation with activists across the UK. We work on global economic issues generally, and we also are supporting a group called Students Against TTIP, which is obviously the focus of this talk and what we're doing here this evening. And my main thing is about supporting people in their activism and campaigning. So I'm going to talk to you about the issues, but as Anushka said, as we go on, if there are people who are interested in getting active on this issue, this is an opportunity to think about that as well. And first, just before I carry on, just to say, like, thanks to Anushka and Molly and anyone else who's been involved in organising this. These things don't come about by accident or out of thin air, and it takes work to inform people that something's happening and get people somewhere. So thanks, guys. Okay, cool. So we're going to talk about TTIP. TTIP is the quickest way to pronounce the acronym, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Firstly, can you just put your hand up if you heard about this before seeing anything about this event for today? Okay, so a fair few of you. All right. Is anyone prepared to say what they think of when they think of TTIP? What it's about? Yeah.
I very little. I don't know much about it.
Sure.
But the main thing which has come up to me is the fact that governments or companies, corporations will be able to sue governments because of legislation that may impact their profits.
Yeah, right.
I understand from it.
Yes,
so
yeah.
I noticed in here there's something about modern cigarettes in Australia, which is sort of wrong, on some level.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's one of the things that we'll talk about. Anybody else? Is there anyone who would say they think they know quite a lot about it? They feel like they understand it. Don't worry, I won't pick on you. I'm just interested. I mean, you might feel like it would be bragging to say it. And is there, for the people who've heard of it, who feels like I've heard of it, but I don't really know what this thing is about? Okay, fine. Because it's something that is very significant, I would say, but it's clearly not part of like mainstream public discourse in this country. It's something that the majority of people wouldn't be able to tell you, what it's about really. And we think that's quite significant because TTIP has such sort of profound implications for our society. We think it's something that needs to become a mainstream public issue. And it's the work, as I see it, it's the work of activists and campaigners to try and bring that about. As I said, it's got implications across society. It's the biggest bilateral trade deal in history because it's between the two largest trading blocs in the world, the EU and the US. Right? TTIP, in its essence, is a trade deal between the EU and the US, and they're looking to try and make it easier to do business across the Atlantic. That's the headline really. But it's part of a whole set of trade deals that are being negotiated at the moment, or have been negotiated. The most closely related is CETA, which is even less well known about than TTIP, even though it's further on in the process, and that's the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. and that's between the EU and Canada. Everything I'm going to say about TTIP is basically true of CETA as well. The implications of CETA are maybe slightly less alarming because Canada is a smaller trading bloc than the US, but nonetheless it poses a threat in a similar way, and it's something we also feel we have to fight. Next slide. Like I said, the aim is to make it easy to do business across the Atlantic, and the people who are pushing TTIP forward claim that it will clear away obstacles to trade and promote economic growth. Okay, so I mean, if you think there are issues about economic growth in the first place, then you might already have concerns about TTIP just based on what is being said for it by its proponents. But there's also, grounds to doubt the benefits in terms of economic growth it will bring. But it's part of a kind of, it's part of a broader way of trying to reshape the global economy that falls under the kind of heading of free trade, basically. And a kind of, the ideal of free trade is enshrined in the World Trade Organization and is pushed by the US, the EU, and most of the leading capitalist states, really. I think that there's issues with the idea of free trade, both in theory and in practice, but that's kind of part of the kind of umbrella under which TTIP falls. But let's get on and talk a bit more about what's in it. So, there's really two key aspects to the deal. Although we've got this kind of slightly mystifying acronym, and there are some other acronyms involved as well, when we break it down to its core, it is relatively simple, actually. So on the one hand, you've got this aspiration to reduce barriers to trade, primarily by trying to bring standards across the EU and the US further into line. And on the other hand, you've got this idea of what's called investor protection, which is basically about empowering businesses, giving them new legal rights, and above all, the right, as you were saying, to be able to sue governments for infringing on their expected profits. I'm going to talk about those in a moment, but first I'm just going to talk a little bit about the process through which TTIP has been developed and negotiated, because I think that's quite significant as well. So, yeah, absolutely. So, it's been negotiated away from the public eye. That's part, not the only reason, but part of why it's not so much an issue of mainstream discourse. The people negotiating it, primarily, are bureaucrats. So civil servants working for the EU Commission and for the US Treasury that are the people working on this text most closely. And there's a limited number of politicians who actually have direct access to it. The most powerful politicians do, yes. But for example, does anyone know who that is? In the bottom right-hand corner. So she's actually your representative in the European Parliament. That's Molly Scott-Cato. So she's a Green MEP for the South West in the European Parliament. And I saw Molly talk about TTIP last year, and she was talking about the process that she had to go through in order to see summaries of some of the negotiating texts. It's quite sort of extraordinary. It sounds ridiculous, but this is what happened. So she had to go into a locked room, before which she was forced to sign a disclaimer saying that she wouldn't reveal the contents of anything that she was reading. She went into a room and she was able to read the documents under surveillance. There was somebody there the whole time while she was reading the documents. And she could look at them one at a time. She could take notes, but then she wasn't allowed to take her notes out of the room with her. And she's bound by what she signed not to reveal what she read in that room. Okay? It sounds completely insane, but that is the kind of level of secrecy and control that is embedded in the process of negotiating TTIP, right? And maybe it's worth reflecting on why do people care that much about this. At the same time, the people like the European Commission, in developing TTIP and its position on TTIP, has nonetheless had an awfully large number of meetings with corporate lobbyists. So in the early stages of negotiations, 2012 to 2013, 90% of its meetings with external parties were with representatives of business, and only 10% were with representatives of NGOs or unions or civil society groups. And that reflects, we think, the kind of interests that are really driving TTIP and the way in which corporate interests are really embedded in this whole free trade agenda, really, and right at the heart of what the European Commission and the US are trying to achieve. But let's talk a bit about the kind of real substance of this. Okay, so like I said, there are two key things about TTIP. There's the aim to get rid of so-called barriers to trade and bring standards into line, and then there's the stuff about being able to sue governments. So, on the first of those, the idea is, well, it's easier to do trade if the standards in the EU and in the US are the same, right? And that would seem to make sense. Example that's often given is about license plates. You know, different license plate arrangements in the EU and the US. If you want to take your car to the US, it's a complicated process to get a new license plate and register to go to drive in the US if you're from the EU. Okay, fair enough. But what we're concerned about is that actually some really crucial fundamental standards could be dragged down, because this kind of bringing standards into line, what's sometimes called harmonization or regulatory cooperation, these are some of this is some of the jargon that's used. What that stands for, what that will represent, is dragging things down to the kind of lowest common denominator. So in the EU, there are a number of valuable standards that are higher